the disrespectful CEO. The sound of footsteps echoed in the sleek, modern hallway of Titan Corporation. Employees scurried back to their desks as Mark, the CEO, strode in, his sharp suit and confident smirk radiating authority. Mark was known for his arrogance and short temper, and no one dared to cross him. In the corner of the building's lobby, John quietly mopped the marble floors. He was a middle-aged janitor, with a calm presence and kind eyes. Despite the long hours and the disrespect he often faced, he always did his job with dignity. Mark paused near the reception desk, glancing at John with a sneer. "Still here, huh? You'd think by now they'd get robots to do this kind of work," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. A few employees chuckled nervously, avoiding John's gaze. John looked up briefly, his face expressionless. "Good morning, Mr. Mark," he said politely before continuing to mop. Mark's smirk widened. "You know, John, you could aim a little higher in life. Maybe one day you'll make it past cleaning floors." The mockery in his tone was clear. Sarah, a young marketing assistant, watched the scene unfold from her desk. She clenched her fists, her face showing discomfort at Mark's words. But like everyone else, she stayed silent. Speaking up against the CEO was career suicide. Mark, satisfied with his display of power, walked away. John didn't respond, but Sarah noticed the slight tightening of his jaw as he continued working. She admired his restraint, but couldn't help feeling angry on his behalf. Later that day, during a staff meeting in the grand conference room, Mark called for coffee. "John," he barked over the intercom. When John entered with the coffee tray, Mark pointed to a small spill on the floor near the window. "Clean that up, and do it quickly. We're in the middle of something important," Mark said with a dismissive wave. The room went silent as John knelt to wipe the spill. Mark leaned back in his chair, smirking at the discomfort on his employees' faces. It was clear he enjoyed putting John in his place. As John finished and stood up, Mark couldn't resist another jab. "You're lucky we let you work here, John. Most places wouldn't even bother hiring someone with no ambition." This time, John met Mark's gaze for a brief moment. His calm expression didn't change, but there was something in his eyes, something unshakable. "I'm just doing my job, sir," he said simply, before leaving the room. After the meeting, whispers filled the office. Some employees felt guilty for not speaking up, while others dismissed it as just Mark being Mark. Sarah, however, couldn't let it go. "Why does he treat him like that?" she whispered to her colleague James. "Because he can," James replied. John never fights back, and Mark loves having someone to push around. As the day ended, John quietly clocked out, his work for the day done. Walking through the bustling city streets, he seemed lost in thought. He passed by a small diner, where the waitress greeted him warmly. "Long day?" she asked, as she poured him a cup of coffee. John smiled faintly. Just another day. But inside, he wondered how much longer he could endure Mark's relentless disrespect. Little did anyone know, John wasn't just a janitor. His quiet patience hid a past that could bring Mark's world crashing down. And one day, that truth would come out. The secret past. The city lights twinkled as John walked home, his steps steady, but his mind restless. His small apartment sat on the outskirts of town, a quiet refuge away from the chaos of the corporate world. It was a modest space, but inside, it held secrets that no one at Titan Corporation could have guessed. John placed his keys on a worn wooden table and glanced at a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. For a moment, he hesitated, his hand hovering near the lock. He shook his head, muttering to himself, "Not yet." Instead, he sat on his couch, staring at the wall as memories from another life crept into his thoughts, memories he had tried to bury. Meanwhile, at Titan Corporation, Sarah couldn't shake the scene from earlier that day. Mark's constant belittling of John gnawed at her. She decided to ask around about the quiet janitor. "Hey, James," she said, cornering her co-worker during a coffee break. Do you know anything about John? He seems different. Like, there's more to him than he lets on. James shrugged. Not much. He keeps to himself. I heard he used to live somewhere else before he came here, but that's about it. Sarah wasn't satisfied. Doesn't it bother you how Mark treats him? She pressed. James sighed. Of course it does, but what can we do? Mark's the CEO. He'll ruin anyone who gets in his way. Sarah frowned, but stayed quiet. Deep down, she knew James was right. Standing up to Mark could cost her everything. But something about John's calm demeanor made her believe there was more to his story. Part 2. The secret. Past the city lights twinkled as John walked home, his steps steady, but his mind restless. His small apartment sat on the outskirts of town, a quiet refuge away from the chaos of the corporate world. It was a modest space, but inside, it held secrets that no one at Titan Corporation could have guessed. John placed his keys on a worn wooden table and glanced at a locked cabinet in the corner of the room. For a moment, he hesitated, his hand hovering near the lock. He shook his head, muttering to himself, "Not yet." Instead, he sat on his couch, staring at the wall, as memories from another life crept into his thoughts, memories he had tried to bury. Meanwhile, at Titan Corporation, Sarah couldn't shake the scene from earlier that day. Mark's constant belittling of John gnawed at her. She decided to ask around about the quiet janitor. "Hey James," she said, cornering her co-worker during a coffee break. "Do you know anything about John? He seems different. Like, there's more to him than he lets on." James shrugged. "Not much. He keeps to himself. I heard he used to live somewhere else before he came here, but that's about it." Sarah wasn't satisfied. "Doesn't it bother you how Mark treats him?" She pressed. James sighed. "Of course it does, but what can we do? Mark's the CEO. He'll ruin anyone who gets in his way." Sarah frowned, but stayed quiet. Deep down, she knew James was right. Standing up to Mark could cost her everything. But something about John's calm demeanor made her believe there was more to his story. Back at his apartment, John finally gave in to his thoughts. He unlocked the cabinet and pulled out a small box. Inside were medals, photographs, and a folded uniform. Each item told a story of bravery, sacrifice, and a life far removed from mopping floors. One photograph caught his eye, a younger version of himself standing with a group of soldiers, all in full gear. His fingers traced the edges of the photo as he remembered their faces, their voices, and the missions that had defined his life. But those days were over now. He had left that world behind, trading danger and glory for a quiet life. Yet, Mark's constant insults were testing his patience. As John stared at the photograph, his phone buzzed on the table. The number on the screen was unlisted. He hesitated before answering. "Hello," a deep voice responded. "We've been trying to reach you, John. We need your expertise on a sensitive matter." John's grip on the phone tightened. "I told you, I'm done. I don't do that anymore." The voice on the other end paused before replying. "Understood. But if you ever change your mind, you know where to find us." The call ended, leaving John in silence. He placed the phone down and sighed deeply. His past wasn't as buried as he'd hoped. At Titan Corporation, Mark was oblivious to the growing tension. For him, John was just a target for his arrogance, a reminder to everyone else of who held the power. Sarah, however, couldn't ignore her instincts. Something about John didn't add up. She decided to do a little digging online, searching for any clues about his past. Her efforts led her to a startling discovery. A name popped up in an old article. John had been part of an elite special forces unit, decorated for his service. The article was vague, but mentioned his involvement in several classified missions. Sarah's heart raced as she pieced it together. Why would someone like him end up as a janitor? She wondered aloud. The breaking point. The office buzzed with the usual flurry of activity, But something felt different today. As John mopped the floors, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. His past, the one he had worked so hard to bury, was slowly creeping back into his life, and he knew it wasn't going to let him go quietly. Mark's voice boomed down the hallway as usual, echoing through the building. John, where's that coffee? We're waiting." His tone was loud and demanding, as if the world revolved around him. John took a deep breath and silently walked to the break room to grab the coffee tray. The truth was, Mark had never treated anyone with respect except perhaps himself. He had built his empire by pushing others down, stepping on anyone who got in his way. And today, he was going to do it again. But John had reached his limit. As John entered the conference room, Mark was in the middle of a heated discussion with his management team. The group fell silent when John entered, each person knowing their place. No one ever dared speak up against the CEO, but today, things would be different. Finally, Mark said with a smirk, taking the coffee cup from John's tray. "What took you so long? You must really like dragging your feet." John's expression remained unchanged. "Sorry, Mr. Mark," he said quietly, though his words were laced with a calm intensity. Mark took a sip of the coffee, then glanced at John with a sneer. "I bet your entire life revolves around this job, doesn't it? Cleaning up after people like me. How pathetic." The room shifted uncomfortably. The employees, too scared to speak, watched the exchange unfold. Sarah, sitting at the back of the room, felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. She hated how Mark treated John. But now, there was something more in his eyes, something that told her this wouldn't end the way it usually did. She could feel the tension building. For John, every day at Titan Corporation had been a battle. But today was different. The words Mark had spoken, the mockery, the constant disrespect, it had all piled up, and John knew he couldn't keep letting it slide. As Mark took another sip of coffee, John stood still, his gaze unwavering. He knew it was time. The man he used to be, the man with honor, strength, and a sense of justice, was starting to resurface. "Mr. Mark," John said, his voice steady, "I don't think you realize just how disrespectful you've been. To me, and to everyone else you walk over." Mark's eyes narrowed, his smirk fading. The room seemed to hold its breath. No one had ever spoken to the CEO like that. Not once. "Excuse me?" Mark said, his voice low and dangerous. "You heard me," John replied, his voice calm but firm. "I've put up with your insults for too long, but no more. You may think you're above everyone else, but you're not. You'll learn that soon enough." The room fell silent. Mark's face turned red with anger. But there was something else in his eyes, something that John had seen before in his past. It was fear. Mark, never one to back down, stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You think you can talk to me like that?" His voice was sharp, filled with fury. "You're nothing but a janitor. You have no power here. Do you understand?" John didn't flinch. His heart pounded, but his mind was clear. "I understand perfectly, Mr. Mark," he said quietly, "but I don't care about your power anymore." Sarah, watching from the back of the room, felt a rush of admiration for John. She had never seen him like this before. She had seen him endure Mark's insults time and time again, but today he had stood up for himself. She wanted to do something, say something, but she knew better. The consequences of standing up to Mark were severe. Still, she couldn't help but feel like something was about to change. Mark glared at John for a long moment, trying to intimidate him with his presence. But John didn't flinch. Finally, Mark sneered. "You'll regret this, John. No one disrespects me like this." "I've been regretting it for a long time," John replied, his voice low but resolute. "And I'm done." With that, John turned and walked out of the room, leaving a stunned silence behind him. No one moved. The employees sat frozen in their seats, unsure of what to make of the confrontation. Sarah watched John leave, her thoughts racing. She knew the world would never look the same again, not for John and not for Mark. As John stepped outside into the cold air, he took a deep breath. The weight of his words hung in the air, but there was a sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, he felt like himself again, like the man he used to be. But he also knew this was only the beginning. Whatever happened, the reckoning the following day, the tension at Titan Corporation was palpable. Word had spread quickly through the office about the confrontation between John and Mark. Whispers filled the halls, some in shock, others in disbelief. No one had ever seen John stand up to the CEO like that before. It was the talk of the office, but no one dared to speak openly about it. John arrived at work early, as he always did. He walked through the empty office, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead, the only sound that filled the air. His mind was sharp and focused, but there was a heavy weight on his shoulders. He knew things wouldn't be the same after what had happened the day before. He headed straight to the janitor's closet, his usual routine, but it felt different today. The mop, the bucket, the broom, these simple tools had been a part of his life for so long, but they no longer defined him. Next, he was ready. As the office began to fill with employees, Sarah kept her eyes on John. She could tell he wasn't the same man who had quietly gone about his work for years. His posture was straighter, his movements more deliberate. She knew something had shifted within him, but she didn't know what. She approached him as he mopped the floor in the hallway. Her heart raced as she prepared to speak to him, unsure of how to start. She had questions, but most of all, she felt the need to understand him better. "John," she said softly, not wanting to break the fragile silence between them. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Sarah," he replied, his voice steady. "Are you okay?" she asked, hesitant. John nodded slowly. "I'm fine. Just had enough of things going the way they have been." His tone was calm, but there was something else beneath it, an unspoken resolve, a quiet confidence that Sarah hadn't seen before. Sarah glanced around, making sure no one else was listening. "What happened yesterday? That wasn't like you," she said cautiously. "What's going on with you, John?" John hesitated for a moment. His eyes flickered to the floor, then back up at Sarah. "I've been keeping a lot hidden for a long time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mark's words, his actions, they brought something out in me that I thought I'd buried." Sarah leaned in, her curiosity growing. "You're not just a janitor, are you?" John's eyes hardened for a split second, then softened again. "I was once something. Someone else. A long time ago." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Someone else?" Before John could respond, Mark stormed into the hallway, his presence like a storm cloud overhead. His gaze locked onto John, and for a moment the air felt electric. Mark snapped, pointing directly at John. "Get to my office." Now. John stood tall, not backing down, but Sarah could feel the tension crackling between them. She couldn't help but wonder what was going to happen next. She had a feeling that whatever was coming, it wouldn't be good for Mark's office. The air was thick with hostility. John stood before the CEO's desk, arms crossed, his expression hard as stone. Mark paced in front of him, his anger barely contained. "Listen here, John," Mark said, his voice low but furious. "You think you can talk to me like that yesterday, and there won't be consequences? You're just a janitor. I don't care what you think about me, but if you ever disrespect me again, I'll make sure you regret it. Do you understand?" John didn't flinch. He stood his ground, unshaken by Mark's fury. "You've been disrespecting me for years. You've been treating everyone here like dirt. I've had enough. If you want to get rid of me, fine. But know this, I won't back down." Mark's face turned red with anger. He slammed his fist onto the desk, causing the papers to scatter. "You think I'll let you get away with this? You'll be out on the streets before the end of the week." John's expression remained unchanged. "I've been on the streets before. I've been through worse." "You can't scare me," Mark sneered. "You think you're tough? You're nothing but a washed-up has-been. And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." John's eyes narrowed. "You don't know who you're messing with, Mark." Mark paused, narrowing his eyes. "What is that supposed to mean?" John took a step forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous calm. "You have no idea who I really am. But you're about to find out." Sarah stood just outside Mark's office, her heart pounding in her chest. She had overheard the entire conversation. What was happening? John's calm, steady demeanor was one thing, but the words he had spoken, those weren't the words of a simple janitor. She felt a mix of admiration and concern. John had stood up to Mark in a way she never thought possible. But now, it seemed like things were escalating quickly. She didn't know what to expect next, but she was certain of one thing. The man who had quietly mopped floors for years was gone. And the man who stood before Mark, now he wasn't just a janitor. He was someone else entirely. As John walked out of Mark's office, his expression unreadable, Sarah followed closely behind him. She needed answers, but she also knew that whatever secrets John was hiding, he wasn't ready to share them yet. John paused and looked at her, his face softening for a brief moment. "I didn't want you to find out like this," he said quietly. Sarah's curiosity burned even brighter. "Find out what, John?" He sighed deeply, his gaze distant. "Everything. The truth about who I am. About what I used to do." Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was it. The truth was coming out piece by piece. But she had no idea just how deep this story went. As the day wore on, the atmosphere at Titan Corporation became charged with an electric tension. Everyone was on edge, waiting to see how Mark would respond to John's defiance. But more than that, Sarah couldn't help but. The showdown. The tension at Titan Corporation was palpable. John's revelation had sent ripples through the company, and word had started spreading fast. Employees who had once ignored him or dismissed him as just a janitor were now looking at him with a mix of awe and disbelief. The quiet, unassuming man they had passed by every day had just told them he was a retired Special Forces operative. But how could that be? What was John really up to? Meanwhile, Mark sat in his office, his mind consumed by the growing uncertainty. Everything had changed overnight. He could no longer ignore the possibility that John's past might not be a lie. The power dynamic between them had shifted. What was once a CEO's world, where everyone obeyed his every command, was now suddenly uncertain. He needed answers. He needed to know exactly who John was and why he had been hiding in plain sight for so long. Mark's thoughts were interrupted when his assistant, Lisa, knocked on the door. "Sir, John is here to see you," she said, her voice hesitant. "Send him in," Mark replied, trying to sound confident, though his nerves were on edge. This confrontation was inevitable, and he had no idea what to expect. The door opened, and John walked in with the same calm, purposeful stride he always had. But today, his presence felt different. There was an undeniable air of power about him now, a sense of quiet authority that Mark hadn't seen before. John was no longer just the janitor. He was a man with a past, a man who had seen and done things that Mark couldn't even imagine. John stood across from Mark's desk, waiting for the CEO to speak. "Well, John," Mark began, his voice thick with tension, "I must say, I never expected this. You've been hiding in plain sight all these years, pretending to be someone you're not. Why? Why didn't you tell anyone what you really were?" John's gaze was unwavering as he met Mark's eyes. He didn't flinch or look away. "I wasn't hiding, Mark," he said quietly. "I was trying to forget. I was trying to leave that life behind, to live in peace. I thought I could do it. But when you started treating me like garbage, when you started disrespecting me and everyone else here, I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. It's not about what I used to do. It's about how you've treated people. Mark narrowed his eyes. So, you think you can just walk in here and make demands because of your military background? Do you think that gives you the right to speak to me like that? John shook his head. No. I'm not here to make demands. I'm here to stand up for what's right. I'm here to show you that you're not untouchable. You're not above everyone else. The way you treat people, the way you think you can get away with anything, those days are over. The air between them was thick with tension. Mark was still trying to process what John had said. Could this really be happening? Was the man he had so easily dismissed truly a special forces operative? The reality of the situation was dawning on him, and it wasn't one he liked. You think you can just waltz in here and change everything? Mark's voice grew more aggressive. You're nothing but a janitor now. What can you possibly do to me? John took a step forward, his eyes cold and steady. I'm not just a janitor, Mark. I'm someone who's seen enough to know how to handle situations like this. You may have the money, the power, but I've got something you'll never have: integrity. And I'm not afraid to stand up to you. What's worse is that people are watching. They see what you're doing. And when the truth comes out, they won't side with you. Mark stood up, his face reddening with anger. You're a fool if you think anyone here will take your side over mine. I built this company. I've worked hard to get where I am. I've made Titan Corporation what it is, and I won't let one disgruntled ex-soldier ruin everything I've worked for. John's expression didn't change. It's not about what you've built, Mark. It's about how you've built it. If you've trampled on people to get where you are, it's only a matter of time before everything crumbles. I'm not here to ruin you. I'm here to remind you that actions have consequences. Mark paused. His pulse quickened. He had never felt so cornered, so vulnerable. He had always been in control. He had always held the power. But now, for the first time, he realized that John, this man he had dismissed for years, held more than just a few dirty secrets. He held the truth, and he was ready to expose it. John took one last look at Mark before turning to leave. You'll see, Mark. The truth always comes out in the end. You can't hide from it forever. As John stepped out of the office, Mark stood frozen, staring at the door. His mind was racing. What had just happened? He had spent years building his empire, but now it felt like it was all slipping through his fingers. The man he had called a janitor had just exposed him in front of his own eyes, and there was no going back. John's words echoed in Mark's head as he slowly sank back into his chair. The truth always comes out in the end. It was a warning, but it was also a promise. And Mark knew deep down that John wasn't the one who would be ruined. It was him. As John walked down the hallway, he could feel the weight of the moment. He had stood up to the CEO. He had exposed the truth. But now, the real battle was just beginning. Would Mark retaliate? Would he try to silence John and cover up the truth? One thing was certain: the days of quiet endurance were over. John had taken his stand, and now the world would see the truth about the man who'd once been nothing more than the janitor. The next move would be up to Mark, and John was ready for whatever came next. The truth unleashed. The weeks following John's confrontation with Mark were filled with tension. At first, it seemed like nothing would change. Mark kept up his usual routine, showing up at work, holding meetings, and overseeing operations at Titan Corporation. But the undercurrent of unease was undeniable. Employees who had once feared Mark began to question his leadership. Whispers spread through the halls about the janitor, who was once an elite special forces operative. People started to look at Mark with doubt, and the facade of control he had built began to crack. John, meanwhile, had not stayed silent. With quiet resolve, he started speaking to anyone who would listen, sharing his story with the employees. He didn't seek fame or glory. He only wanted the truth to be known. He didn't care about the title he once held. What mattered was that people understood what kind of person Mark truly was. The more John shared, the more others came forward, telling stories of how Mark had mistreated them, how he had turned a blind eye to injustice for years. Mark, however, was not about to let things slide. His empire, his reputation was on the line. He had always been in control, always been the one pulling the strings. He had no intention of losing everything because of one man's words. But as hard as he tried to suppress the truth, it seemed like the more he fought, the more it spread. Employees were beginning to question his authority. Rumors turned into whispers, and whispers turned into open discussions. The CEO's grip on his company was slipping. One day, a major meeting was called in the company's headquarters. Mark knew this was coming. The board of directors, those who had been loyal to him for years, were finally starting to show signs of doubt. The meeting was not just about business, it was about his future at Titan Corporation. John's actions had caused a ripple effect, and Mark knew that the storm was about to break. The room was tense as Mark entered. The faces of the board members were all serious, none showing the familiar respect he had once enjoyed. As he took his seat at the head of the table, he noticed a shift. The usual nods of approval were absent, replaced by quiet stares and whispers that no longer masked their growing doubts. "Mark," began the head of the board, Roger, a man who had been with Titan since its early days. His voice was steady, but there was a certain coldness in his tone. "There's been a lot of talk around here lately. People are concerned. We've heard things about you and about John." Mark's face tightened. He knew this was coming, but it still hit him like a punch to the gut. "What things?" he asked, his voice a little sharper than he intended. Roger exchanged a look with the other members of the board before responding. "It's not just about the past. It's about the way you've handled things recently. John's story has gotten a lot of attention. People are saying that you've mistreated him. They're saying you've treated others the same way. And quite frankly, Mark, it's becoming a liability for the company." Mark clenched his jaw, trying to maintain control. He had spent years building Titan Corporation into the powerhouse it was today. He wasn't about to let some disgruntled janitor and a few murmurs from the employees ruin everything. "John's a liar. He's just trying to make a name for himself," Mark retorted, his voice rising. But Roger didn't flinch. "It's not just John, Mark. The employees are starting to speak up. There are complaints. And, honestly, we can't ignore this any longer. We need to think about the future of this company and the reputation we're building. You're the CEO, but the people are losing faith." The words hit Mark like a cold wave. He had been at the top for so long that he had never imagined a moment like this where the tide might turn, where the very foundation of his authority could crumble beneath him. But as the reality set in, he realized there was no escaping it. The board had already made up their minds. They had lost trust in him. "I've built this company," Mark shouted, his anger flaring up. "I've worked harder than anyone else here. You can't just throw all that away over a few lies." Roger remained calm, his voice steady. "We're not throwing everything away, Mark. But we can't ignore what's happening. The way you've treated people, the way you've taken them for granted, those things matter. And they're catching up with you." The meeting continued, but Mark's mind was elsewhere. He could feel the walls closing in. His grip on Titan Corporation was slipping away. The power he had wielded for so long was fading, and he knew there was nothing he could do to stop it. The truth about him, about the way he had treated people, had come to light, and there was no hiding from it anymore. As the meeting ended, Mark left the room in silence. He could hear the murmurs of the board members behind him, but he didn't turn around. He walked back to his office, the weight of the moment heavy on his shoulders. He knew that his days as CEO were numbered. The company he had built, the empire he had created, was on the brink of collapse. And all because of one man, the janitor who had quietly endured, who had finally stood up for what was right. John had done what no one else had the courage to do. He had exposed Mark for who he truly was. And now, the truth was out. It was only a matter of time before the consequences caught up with the once untouchable CEO. The end of Mark's reign had come, and the truth had set everything in motion. It was the beginning of a new era for John, for Titan Corporation, and for all those who had been silently oppressed. The truth always comes out in the end. And when it did, it changed everything.